So could you start there? Because you had your own health problems that led you into this. What were they? What was your story?
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks so much for having me on your show. I've been looking forward to this. The mold industry, or I would say the career path that led me to where I am, is not one that is essentially an academic track, right? There's no, there's lots of subspecialties, but this is a really multidisciplinary field. Because you have to really have a grasp of not only the biology of the body, but also the biology of the building, right? How buildings are built correctly, how they're built incorrectly. And so most of the people that are doing great work in this space come from a very personal experience. This is just, and so I'm no exception to that. So I initially became aware of this actually after a successful career on Wall Street. So a little bit late in the game by some measures, but I was still pretty young at the time. I had decided after the dot-com bubble burst, I wanted to do something meaningful with my life. And so I threw 20 pounds of stuff in a backpack and I went traveling. And it was just after September 11th. So I tried to stay, pretty close to home, but I ended up in Hawaii, which is not a bad place to end up for a while. And I was, had a lot of time on my hands. So I was reading local newspapers and magazines and stuff. In fact, I was reading this one particular story while I was in Oahu, in the shadow of the Kalia Hilton Tower, which at the time was shut down for a major mold problem. And I was completely unwitting to the historical significance of this particular thing. It turns out it was the biggest mold problem in history at the time. The one story that really popped out at me was, and by the way, this story was all over the news. It was not isolated to one magazine. It was big news because it was Hilton's flagship building. And in any case, the story that really jumped out at me was about a 40-year-old former employee of the hotel, who had been otherwise healthy, but had developed adult onset asthma, as well as all of these allergies and sensitivities to things he'd never had a problem with before. And it was like a deja vu moment or like a time machine. I was immediately brought back to my childhood, where when I was about 4 years old, I suddenly lost a lot of weight in a 3-week period, about 30% of my body weight, according to my parents. And I was having difficulty breathing. So they took me to the pediatrician, who said, you really need to take him to Children's Hospital. This looks serious. And so they did. And they took me to, CHOP, which is the world-renowned respiratory clinic in Philadelphia. And based upon family history and the symptoms that I was presenting with, the initial diagnosis was cystic fibrosis, which at the time was a death sentence, right? I'm 46. So that was a very short life that I was looking towards. My parents were devastated for obvious reasons, but my dad in particular, because he had lost 4 of his cousins to CF before the age of 14. So this was their worst nightmare, coming true. So they cried for 6 weeks, as they describe, while they waited for a second opinion, which fortunately contradicted the initial diagnosis. Actually, it turns out I didn't have CF, don't have CF, but I did have asthma compounded by pneumonia, which was my first big dose of antibiotics, by the way. So that's part of the whole story. And I was also subjected to this allergy testing, which was, it's one of my formative memories. They put you in a papoose, or like a straitjacket for toddlers, and then with an open back, and then draw a grid on your back, and then expose you to all these antigens and all these allergens. And so my dad said, look like a ladybug, just a big red swollen back with dots all over it. And I essentially tested positive for every single thing that they tested me for. So, in summary, grass, wheat, corn, eggs, dogs, cats, cotton. So my clothes were itchy, soybeans. And I grew up on a little non-working farm, a hobby farm, where I was surrounded by all those things in great abundance. And literally with soybean fields to the right, cornfields across the street, and dogs and cats everywhere. And my parents had a very unique a concept around hygiene. So needless to say, they accumulated. And both of them smoked indoors, as well as in the car with an asthmatic kid, because, that's what you did in the 70s and the 80s. And, these days, children, I'm sure child services would have had some things to say about that, but that was the de facto standard. So, and it wasn't for lack of love. It was just a lack of awareness. And so, but the bottom line is I lived like that until I was about 12, at which point my folks split up and I moved out of that very damp house. And all my symptoms went away, as did my grandfather's, by the way. They call it spontaneous adolescent remission, instead of looking at what might have actually been a root cause. And And so then shortly thereafter, my mother passed away suddenly. She committed suicide, actually, which is relevant, believe it or not, to the mold story. And then a year later, I was diagnosed with Lyme disease, where I got my next big, face full of antibiotics. And that was potent, because that was before they really had an established regimen. So it was very experimental. And so it was like 30 pills of Biaxin and stuff like that per day for 3 days. And then it was off for 3 days, this pulse therapy thing that they were doing. And then I ended up dropping out of high school, long story short, and got actually working full time in a gas station, where I met a guy who recruited me to come work for him on Wall Street, which is a story for another podcast, I think. But in any case, the story in Hawaii was this transporting thing, where I immediately became fascinated with the concept, because I called my father from a payphone and said, "Hey, do you think we had a mold problem at Old Trenton Road?" Not knowing anything about mold, right? I was a stockbroker and read this article. That was the totality of my knowledge about mold. And he goes, "Of course, we had mushrooms in the basement. Why do you ask?" So, typical of my father. He's so flippant about these things. And I said, "So do you think that was, part of the reason why I was sick?" And he goes, "Couldn't have helped." So it was, And so it was literally from that moment on, I had the kind of like this epiphany, or this light bulb moment, where all the pieces of the puzzle kind of, became clear to me, which was that I became fascinated with not mold per se, although it's fascinating. And the more I know about it, the more fascinating it is. Actually, the impact of buildings, the buildings that we live and work in, on our health. And this is a blind spot in the world. It's a blind spot, certainly in the medical community. But unfortunately, it's also a blind spot with the people who live in these buildings, the people that, because, we're like, it reminds me of the commencement address by David Foster Wallace. I don't know if you've ever seen this, but he talks about, this is water. And he talks about the two young fish rather. And they're swimming along on their own business, and the older fish passes them by and says, "Good morning, boys. How's the water?" And they go, "Fine." And look at each other a couple minutes later and like, "What the hell's water?" And that's what we are, that we're like fish, and in the water that we call air. And it is anything but empty space, and it is anything but it is in fact the blind spot of all blind spots. So I became fascinated with that. I came back to New Jersey armed with curiosity and some time on my hands. I was looking for a new career anyway, and I took a job working for a mold remediation contractor. Actually, it was a basement waterproofing contractor that was doing mold treatments, because there was no such thing as mold remediation or standards or best practices or even government guidance for that matter at the time. And these guys were doing everything wrong. And I knew that intuitively. They were using a lot of chemicals, and they were ripping stuff out without proper controls. And so I quickly saw that there was an opportunity here to protect the consumer. So I started an inspection company at night. I was basically doing free inspections until somebody started saying, I should really pay you for this. And then I heard about a guy who trained mold sniffing dogs, and thought that was just brilliant enough to be crazy enough to be brilliant. And got one of those, and that began a cascade of press. It became a Channel 6 Action News thought they were going to debunk us by hiding mold in the house, and instead they endorsed us because we found it in like 3 minutes. And then we got a bunch of doctors started referring patients to us, and then some of those patients, their healing was so profound that it became Good Morning America episodes, and then Extreme Makeover Home Edition, and on and on and on. And that company became 1-800-GOT-MOLD, our mold inspection business. And then over the years, just quickly so where I am right now, is that we, over the years, it was difficult for me to stomach the fact that most of the people who needed mold inspections, needed mold testing, couldn't afford it. And so, including my own parents, right? So to bring this full circle, to actually really build something that would have solved the problem that my parents went through, I had to come up with an affordable solution. And so it took years to develop, but we launched last March, the Got Mold Test Kit, which is the first and it's the most affordable, reliable, scientifically valid do-it-yourself test kit on the market. And so it's been a long road. It's been 20 years I've been doing this, learning every single day, because this is just it's an environment. It's an area where there's tremendous research emerging. And there's also, it's just riddled with myths and misconceptions and all of these wives' tales and all of these things that the average consumer or even the average physician is so mired in that it feels like almost every interaction is an education session, and that's okay. That's what I sign up for. But at the end of the day, this has been I'm an accidental expert, right? It was one of those things where, it's just the way sometimes life gives you a path and you follow it. And next thing you know, you're, where I sit right here.
Yeah. I find accidental experts to be the most proficient ones. They don't have the ego that goes with, I've been doing this my whole life. It's more of I went through this and had to, for my own life, become an expert and do it for a benevolent way, of course, for yourself first, but then to pass it along and pay it forward.